I guess this was always my interest after I learned electronic music is to find the areas that are new and sort of like it's the optimism of electronic music. You can find new sounds. And if I can find the edges of the instrument and things that are unexpected, that's that discovery that's creating something that you haven't heard before, which is amazing that you can still do that. This is something which is open and allows you to really get into the new stuff and allows you to speak through it as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Reid and welcome back. So a little over a year ago, I released a video about Make Noise's module Spectraphon. Spectraphon is an oscillator that allows you to analyze and resynthesize sonic characteristics of other sounds, using those characteristics to create really unique waveforms and timbres with the ability to continuously morph and alter them. Spectraphon is a complex oscillator for Eurorack modular systems, designed in collaboration between Make Noise and Tom Erbe from Soundhack, using a new DSP platform that was developed by Jeff Snyder of Snyder Phonics. So back in my original video, which I'll leave a link to below, I mentioned that Spectraphon draws inspiration from some early Buchla devices from the 1970s, namely the 259 Programmable Complex Waveform Generator, the 296 Programmable Spectral Processor, and the Touché, a hybrid keyboard instrument developed in collaboration between Donald Buchla and David Rosenboom. The history of these three instruments, and specifically how they relate to Spectraphon, was too big of a topic for that original video, but it's something that I still think is really, really interesting and worth exploring further. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Tom Erbe from Soundhack was also kind enough to join me for a brief interview about Spectraphon and how these historic Buchla devices have informed and inspired his work on this module. So I will intersperse snippets from that conversation throughout this video as well. Before we jump into things, I want to say that with Spectraphon, Make Noise is not just recycling ideas from previous synth designs. You'll see as we get deeper into things that they're really drawing inspiration from these historical designs and building upon them in their own unique way to create something entirely new. Okay, so all of my videos on this channel are pretty nerdy, but this one is probably going to be even a little more nerdy than usual. You have been warned. In the 1960s and 1970s, dedicated tools for making electronic music were only just emerging. Many instruments borrowed ideas from early electronic music studios, which were generally built around appropriated scientific test equipment, repurposed for use as sound generators and modifiers. Because many early electronic instrument designers relied in part on analogies borrowed from these contexts, early electronic instruments can, from a modern perspective, seem somewhat crude. One arguably limiting factor in many early electronic instruments was that their sound generators were often fairly fixed in terms of how a sound's timbre or tone color could be generated. In many early commercial synthesizers, for instance, you could typically choose from a couple of different waveforms or noise sources, and you could create more complex timbres by combining sound sources together, detuning oscillators, and using filters. In a structure like this, significant alterations to timbre, beyond simply altering a sound's brightness, for instance, might be difficult to accomplish without abruptly switching between signals or repatching things. When compared to the types of expression offered by other instruments, these types of timbral alterations were not always entirely satisfactory. Many musicians were used to the level of finesse and nuance that they knew from their work with acoustic instruments, which of course can have a wide range of sonic responses depending on how you interact with them. The timbre of a trumpet, for instance, can vary in a large number of ways. Strong articulation can produce very bright, bell tone-like sounds. Pushing the valves down only halfway can create a softer, more filtered tone, and a more breathy attack can impart a very airy, muted quality to the sound. So around this time, the continuous control of timbre became something of an ideal that instrument designers and early computer music researchers strove toward. It was assumed that there might be ways to create tools which provided continuously variable access to a wide range of distinct tones without the need for repatching or reconfiguring the instrument or program you were using. Many instrument developers and composers developed their own idiosyncratic ways of solving this problem, most often working toward ways to provide a large timbral variety with a relatively small number of user-accessible variable controls or parameters. This pursuit led to interesting developments from academic researchers and composers, such as James A. Moore, Daniel Arfib, John Chowning, and others. Operating on the periphery of the academic electronic music world, artist and instrument designer Donald Buchla created his own novel solutions to these problems as well. Even his earliest electronic instruments in the 1960s explored the continuous control of timbre. As his work evolved, though, this specific focus intensified. The Model 259 Programmable Complex Waveform Generator, the Model 296 Programmable Spectral Processor, and the Touché each explored different means of continuously altering a sound's harmonic and spectral content. These three devices were specifically noted as key inspirations for the design of the Make Noise Spectraphon. So let's take a look at each of them one by one and discuss how they have influenced or informed Spectraphon's design. The 259 Programmable Complex Waveform Generator is a common point of reference for modern instrument designers. It is the de facto model of what we now commonly call a complex oscillator. It has two oscillators and a wave shaping section. One oscillator is processed through the wave shaping section, and the other oscillator is generally used to modulate some aspect of the principal oscillator. In the 259, the principal oscillator is subjected to a wavefolder to give you continuously variable control over the sound's harmonic content. The timbre control effectively controls the amount of distortion applied to the principal oscillator's sine wave output, effectively altering the depth of the wave folding. So as it is turned up, the sound spectrum evolves non-linearly, with certain overtones emerging and receding relatively independently of one another, and with the sound generally gaining high-frequency energy as it goes. You also have the ability to create continuous balance between low and high order harmonics and even and odd harmonics, which gives you access to two additional dimensions of spectral variation. Additionally, you can use the modulation oscillator to alter various aspects of the principal oscillator's behavior, including its frequency, amplitude, and the value of the timbre parameter. The modulation oscillator can run at low frequencies or at audio frequencies, unlocking many different opportunities for spectral animation. So if you're familiar with Make Noise's work, you'll probably recognize this general layout and arrangement of features. It was first seen in their 2012 dual prismatic oscillator, or the DPO. The DPO is an analog oscillator with a similar approach to the 259, relying on analog wave shaping and inter-oscillator FM for creating sonic interest. It isn't a direct clone to the 259, though. It has its own distinct personality and really allows you to push its parameters to the extreme. There aren't analog oscillators or analog wave shapers in Spectraphon. However, its form factor still borrows obvious inspiration from the 259 and the DPO before it. It features two oscillators, though unlike the 259 and DPO, Spectraphon's oscillators are identical, each offering a full set of timbre shaping features. It also includes an inter-oscillator FM bus, allowing each oscillator to frequency modulate the other. It also, of course, includes several parameters for the continuous control of timbre: slide, focus, and partials. The partials control, broadly speaking, resembles the behavior of the 259 or DPO's timbre parameter, insofar as that it allows a single one-knob control for the sound's overall brightness. Depending on the current mode of operation, the effects of the slide and focus parameters behave differently. But for the purposes of this discussion, it's important to understand that, like the 259, Spectraphon uses multiple continuously variable parameters to define its timbre, making it possible to dynamically access many different types of sound by focusing on a small number of controls.
you do notice this common thread of starting with basic waveforms and then having the timbral modification. In the case of the complex oscillator, there you have wave folding instead of wave shaping. And it has its own flavors, and you have the symmetry control, so you can clip it on the positive or the negative and bring out different characters, and also has the FM. Actually, just a really nice sounding FM. Or the wonderful thing about the Buchla complex oscillators and a few others is that even the really atonal stuff sounds visceral and musical.
The 296 Programmable Spectral Processor is another point of inspiration for Spectraphon. However, the 296 isn't an oscillator. It's a relatively elaborate audio processor. The 296 is a 16-band fixed filter bank that allows you to process incoming sounds by continuously altering the loudness of distinct individual frequency bands across the sound's spectrum. You can even completely remove parts of the incoming sound altogether. Once you plug a sound source into the 296, you can manipulate its spectrum in a number of ways: by using the dedicated sliders for each band, by modulating the levels of each band, or by using a set of macro controls for addressing the amplitude of specific regions of the filter bank. Additionally, the 296 has separate outputs for odd and even spectral regions, which is something that we also see reflected in Spectraphon's design. In the 296, even and odd simply refer to the channel number of each individual filter band, 0 to F. In Spectraphon, however, the odd and even output represent the odd and even numbered overtones of the current sound. In either case, though, this enables you to separate the spectrum into interleaved chunks. From there, you could process the odd and even outputs separately, or use the odd and even outputs to create a peculiar stereo image that spreads your sound spectrum out across space. One of the other particularly interesting ways of altering a sound spectrum with the 296, though, involves the use of the programmed spectrum transfer functionality. This allows you to use the 296 like a sort of simple vocoder. Basically, this allows you to use an analysis of, for instance, the odd band's amplitudes to impact the loudness of the even bands, or vice versa. Since you can patch different sound sources into the odd and even bands separately, and since you have access to the summed outputs of the odd and even bands respectively, you can basically use one sound in order to control the spectrum of another. In a sense, Spectraphon can operate quite similarly to this. Though you can't exactly use two external signals to alter one another's spectrum, you certainly can use external audio to alter Spectraphon's generated sounds. In spectral amplitude modulation mode, external signals patched into the signal input will be mapped onto the oscillator's overtone structure, with the slide and focus parameters altering the frequency mapping and time response. This can be very vocoder-like, but it can also venture into much stranger territory, especially when combined with some of the more 259-like features we discussed before. The main takeaway here, though, is that like the 296, Spectraphon allows you to use external audio as a means of continuously altering timbre. Interestingly, in this scenario, there are actually a large number of sonic variables. In Spectraphon, for instance, we're effectively altering the loudness of 64 partials. That's a lot. But because we're able to use a relatively simple and intuitive method of generating the control information, it feels intuitive and easy to explore.
I mean, it's just a fascination with complex instruments. The spectral processor as well. I mean, there it's intended for this one thing, but it does all sorts of other little things as well. It does really nice resonant filtering. It does these unexpected sort of splitting the odd and even harmonics. You get these unexpected sounds. It's just processing sound in a way that's different than anything else out there. It has all this, delicate stuff going on. It's great.
Today, the Buchla 259 and 296 are relatively well known. Each have inspired several modern takes and spin-offs in a variety of formats. One of Spectraphon's most direct sources of inspiration, however, is a more obscure instrument, the Touché. Touché is an 8-voice bitimbral polyphonic keyboard instrument developed by Donald Buchla and David Rosenboom in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It is one of the rarest Buchla designs. Perhaps as few as 4 or 5 instruments were ever made. So why is it that Tom Erbe looked toward this fairly obscure instrument for inspiration for Spectraphon?
I worked at Mills College for several years, 6 years, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s, and there were 3 Buchla Touchés there, which I think is the majority of the instruments, as far as I know. At one point, Bob Ashley came by. He just came by to do an opera. We needed some kind of sound for the Greek choir, and so David built this wonderful droning patch on the Touché. I used a noise gate, so I gated it in for the Greek choir. So that was my first production experience with the Touché. But I always loved the A and B oscillators and how they sort of faded with each other, and the fact that you have FM and you have this other sort of timbre knob, which I didn't quite know what it was yet, but there were all these ways to, change the sound. And it had this sort of sparkling sound, and I think that's due to there being less reliance on filters. I liked that, and the fact that when you turn the knobs, it was adding more spectrum. So you were sort of, starting with very smooth sound and just making it richer. And it had this whole different sort of feel. But I really thought, this is a digital sound I really love. Then I was using DX7s and Casio 101 and this kind of thing. And this was just like a different level of richness. And I thought, but it's older. Like, what's going on here? So I was fascinated with it and just kept that in my library of, gotta try something like this one of these days.
Like the 259 before it, Touché was designed to explore the continuous control of timbre by complicating the spectrum of a basic sine wave. And, like the 259, the Touché allows the use of internal oscillators to modulate a principal oscillator's frequency and timbre. However, unlike the 259, Touché used completely digital sound generation and wave shaping.
Wave shaping is it's a little more ordered way of making denser harmonics. It's not the same as wave folding, but it's related. It's like a more careful. You create a sort of function, a curve, that the sine wave then modulates the curve, and the sine wave is reshaped according to this curve. And then if you design the curve nicely enough, you can have it go through different harmonic states. So this is something I was always really interested in. And finally, at a certain point in my life, I developed enough experience that I could start taking on some wave shaping design projects, or rather, I was patient enough to, go through that thing. And one thing I always wanted to do is like, okay, I want to have a harmonic oscillator built out of wave shaping. And that was a challenge for a while, which, that led to the Spectraphon.
So let's explain. The Touché's wave shaping works using a technique sometimes called digital nonlinear distortion. As Tom mentioned, this technique hinges around defining a transfer function, a sort of conceptual shape that ultimately defines the sonic character of the wave shaping. In the Touché, this transfer function is stored as a two-dimensional table of information. The oscillator's sine wave is essentially used to scan that table. That is, the oscillator is used to scrub through the table at different audio rates. The end result is a distorted translation of the sine wave, whose sonic character is determined in large part by the actual contents of the table. By controlling the width of the window that the sine wave scans, a variety of different timbres can result. And, in fact, the timbre parameter on the Touché does just that. It controls the width of the scanning window, providing continuously variable access to a variety of sonic spectra. This technique in general was somewhat common in 1970s computer music circles, largely because, in an indirect way, it provides a computationally efficient approach to rudimentary forms of additive synthesis. Now, typical definitions of additive synthesis involve the use of many independent oscillators, each with individually controllable frequency and amplitude. However, as it turns out, by using a single sine wave oscillator and a nonlinear digital distortion process, it's possible to generate highly specific spectra. This hinges around the use of a specific type of mathematical function called Chebyshev polynomials. We'll spare the details, but essentially, by using specific Chebyshev polynomials to define the contour of the shaping function, you can translate a sine wave into specific overtones, or combinations of overtones, of the sine wave's fundamental frequency. That is to say that any combination of harmonic overtones can result from this process if you use exactly the right shape for the transfer function. Spectraphon explores this concept in its own way, essentially building a harmonic oscillator using a complex wave shaping process based on analyzing external audio signals.
I said, okay, Tony, I want to do this thing that's like the telharmonic, but it can listen to sounds and capture their spectral imprint so that the user would be able to just play with it and make their own material, and it would be theirs. At the same time, I was working on that idea again of starting with a one sine wave and creating a harmonic series using wave shaping. I finally cracked that one and got it to work. Internally, the whole thing is like one complex sine wave for synthesis, that is sine and cosine, one complex wave for analysis, and then it goes through a wave shaping process which creates 64 analysis and 64 synthesis signs on both sides. So it's doing a lot. And then, you can just sort of make your spectrums and put them in the array table, and there you are. That's the Spectraphon. I thought, okay, I'm going to, since I came up with this, and it's this very sort of different thing, and since I was using wave shaping, I thought, okay, let's touché it a little bit, and we'll add FM to it, and it'll be the FM wave shaping complex oscillators. So now I'll have an A and a B oscillator, and just like the touché, and it's sort of a tribute to that instrument in a way.
So Spectraphon doesn't use the exact approach of the 259, 296, or Touché to determine its behavior, but it borrows snippets from each of them as inspiration for a novel approach to synthesis. All right, so we've taken a look at how the 259, 296, and Touché work, and we've explored how their designs and approaches to sound creation and manipulation have inspired Spectraphon. I personally find it really inspiring to see companies like Make Noise and folks like Tom Erbe celebrating and building upon past instrument designs, while always bringing their own unique and new angles and ideas to things.
When you take an idea like that or an imprint, the first thing is to sort of refine it until it works. And you go through this process, and this process through music where you have it's raw when you first get it in a state where you can actually hear it. And it's really interesting because there's all these spiky, pokey things and unexpected accidents. You turn the knob and suddenly it goes silent, and then it erupts, and it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And you play with it forever. But then you have to refine it so that it has some sort of consistency, so it's whole. And once you get there, it's great, but suddenly you're like, oh, it's boring, or it's just the same, or something. So then you have to take it further. So there's sort of this 3 stages, and that taking it further is it works perfectly, but now you're pushing it into areas where it may not be so lovely, or it may just be so subtle that it barely perceivable. But that's what I like to, I like to have that range.
It's really special to see aspects of these Buchla devices that I know and care about come together and result in something completely unique and equally amazing. I've been using Spectraphon a ton over the last year, and I really love all of the beautiful, strange, abrasive, and delicate sound worlds that you can get to using it. I know that I, for one, sincerely hope that Make Noise will continue these kinds of collaborations and explorations in the future. If you're looking for an amazing community of people who are passionate about things like modular synths and experimental sound, or if you're interested in things like behind the scenes content and unreleased audio, then I invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community at patreon.com/SarahBelleReid. All right, that is it for today. As always, thank you for watching and for listening, and I will see you next time.
I remember last time I ran into Don Buchla, we were at the NAMM show, and he was seeing a lot of instruments that, he's sort of the father of. But I could see that what he was drawn to was the bizarre stuff, the stuff that he hadn't experienced before. And if he saw like some plugin manufacturer somewhere doing, something, or some guitar pedal manufacturer doing something that was new and different, he would be all over that. I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to electronic music, is that it has that optimism built into it, and that feeling of discovery and that feeling of participation. And I think that's what I love about it and what really drives me.